Welcome back, everybody. So we're ready to begin our first real lecture notes. Lecture notes are going to be a regular part of this class. It'll begin with some vocabulary and move into some details specific to each unit. And this unit is Folklore Fundamentals. Here we go. So you should have an assignment that looks like that, the Unit 1 Notes, Folklore Fundamentals. If you don't have it out in front of you, I recommend keeping it in a separate tab so that you can continually pause this video or keep notes along the way. We're going to begin with vocabulary and then move into lecture notes. The first 4 words in our vocabulary are myth, legend, urban legend, and fairy tale. By now, in class, we've already talked a bit about myth, so I hope that you're confident with the idea that a myth is a sacred narrative. It typically involves gods or goddesses and often provides an explanation of the cosmos. So, for example, the story of Prometheus giving fire to human beings would be an example of a myth. A legend is a larger-than-life story that has a kernel of truth. It's passed down through generations, typically told as true, but taken with a grain of salt. So, for example, stories like John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed making his way across the United States and planting apple trees everywhere he went. Or the story of John Henry, who could drive railroad spikes faster than a steam engine. Those stories probably do have some element of truth to them. There may very well have been a real man named John Chapman or one named John Henry, and they really did do something related to their story, but the chances that they actually achieved the superhuman feats that their stories describe are fairly unlikely. The next is a subset of legend called an urban legend. Now, as a legend, it is still a larger-than-life story with a kernel of truth, but an urban legend is different in that it is always set in a recent time and a local place. They are absolutely told as fact, often in the form of scary stories. So, for example, you might get warned about alligators in the sewer somewhere in New York, or you might hear about Slender Man, and if you go off into the woods, then Slender Man will get you. These sorts of things make things feel present. It makes it feel immediate. Even if the story itself is very, very old, it's always updated in order to fit whatever modern society is telling it. Finally, we have a fairy tale. Of all of these, the fairy tale is the one that is told as fiction. It is a fanciful story for children. Typically, these involve magical creatures or talking animals and don't take any time to give explanations for why those things exist. In addition, fairy tales often have a clear moral. So you might have a story like Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella. So those are our primary words for today, but I'm going to add 2 more because they'll relate to the assignment that you'll be doing later. Parable and fable. Now these are both versions of a morality tale, a story that contains a clear and simple moral. A parable is a morality tale featuring human characters who represent larger human traits or follies. For example, the parable of the sower is a story about a person who sows seeds all over the place. Some of those seeds fall in places where they can't grow, others fall in places where they're able to struggle and grow, and others fall in places where they get the nourishment they need and grow very easily. This can then be taken as a metaphor for how we put things out into the world and how we allow for things to grow in many spaces, but we understand that we should focus our efforts where we can have the most success. A fable, on the other hand, is a morality tale featuring animal characters who represent human traits or follies. So an example of that might be something like The Lion and the Mouse. An angry lion from whom all of the other creatures are running catches a mouse, and the mouse says, "Wait, wait, I think I can help you." That mouse eventually finds that the lion has a thorn in its paw and pulls that thorn out in a way that none of the other animals were brave enough or small enough to do, and the lion learns the lesson not to take for granted somebody just because they seem smaller and less impressive. The mouse could be seen as learning the lesson that bullies aren't necessarily as bad as they seem. They might just be suffering in their own way. So, both of those stories in some way convey a moral, but one uses people and the other uses animals. I like the mnemonic that P is for parable and P is for people, while F is for fable and F is for, fur, something like that. It reminds me that parables have humans and fables have animals. So, Those are our vocabulary words for this week. With those done, it's time to move into lecture. Again, if you're keeping track, now would be a good time to make sure you've got all of those vocab words already done and be ready to answer these 4 prompts. So, to get started, what is mythology? Myths are not about what is true or what is false. They don't get classified under fiction or nonfiction. And in spite of what Adam Savage and Jamie Heineman might want you to think, you can't bust them. They are sacred narratives. That means that they're holy stories that matter deeply to a culture. They are the stories that define religions. Mythology is an examination of ancient stories about gods and heroes and creative explanations for the cosmos that are conceived by long-dead civilizations, but it also examines modern stories about gods and heroes and how current societies explain those same phenomena in similar and also different ways. Mythology, in other words, is the study of the most sacred narratives of any culture. They're myths. Myths are their own branch of study, but they do fall under the broader category of folklore. So let's talk about that also. What is folklore? Is that a Taylor Swift album? No, obviously not that. Folklore is the lore of the folk, or knowledge of the people. It's the stuff that gets passed down from generation to generation. This includes their stories, like myths, but also their jokes, their traditions, their superstitions, their crafts, their dances, their costumes, and their songs. So maybe Taylor Swift album does sort of fall under folklore? Well, no, actually. Commercial art is not folklore. So if it's made and published and printed, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is folklore. But if I learn those songs and pass them on or make a tradition of singing them regularly at a certain time of year, then it can become folklore. So we'll give that a 50-50 pass. The stories in folklore are sometimes called folk tales, although that term often just implies fictional tales. Folklore, as a whole, can include myths, legends, urban legends, and fairy tales, all of those words that we just covered in our vocabulary. The most culturally sacred of all of these, of course, are the myths. Myths define a culture's faith, but a myth alone is not a religion. Which brings us to our next category: what is religion? Well, a religion is a sacred set of beliefs. These usually involve holy rituals and some kind of a moral code. You could consider the Buddha's Eightfold Path or the Ten Commandments of Judeo-Christian faiths to be a moral code guiding people to act in a particular way. Myths are one important part of a religion, but traditions, attire, places of worship, and other factors can also be vitally important elements of a religion. The most prevalent religions in the world are Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, although the third largest group is actually non-religious at about 14% of the whole world. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are worth specifically pointing out because they are called the Abrahamic religions. All 3 of them can trace their origins back to a figure named Abraham. He had one son named Isaac, who went on to form Judaism. He had another son named Ishmael, who went on to form Islam. From Isaac's Judaism, eventually we get Christianity, and from Ishmael's Islam, eventually we get the different branches of Islam. The Sunnis and the Shiites, for example. All of those different sects of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all literally brother religions. They come back from those brothers, the sons of Abraham. Together, these 3 Abrahamic faiths comprise roughly half of all of the world's religions. So, with all of that in mind, the number one rule for ethical folklorists is to approach the study with respect. Different cultures have different norms and different taboos. Folklorists can infer a great deal about a society's greatest values by studying their myths and their folktales, but one must strive to view their differences without judgment or implicit bias. And that's what we'll be doing in this class. Alright, that's it for your Folklore Fundamentals vocab and lecture notes. After this, you should have 2 different assignments in the Google Classroom. Now, if you were present in class, you may have already done that first one. It's called classification. If not, jump right in, have some fun with it. It's a simple one, and it should only take you a few minutes. The second is one called morality tale. We'll use those vocab words, parable and fable, in order to start you on the process of working backwards. Instead of inferring themes out of classic stories, you're going to be putting a theme into one. So go ahead and open morality tale now and get started on that assignment if you haven't already. As always, if you need help with anything or anything doesn't make sense, then swing by my office hours Monday, Thursday from 2:30 to 3:30, or shoot me an email. And until I see you in class next time, take care.